Autumn presents
A Father, a Daughter, and the Attempt to Change the Census. Written by Charles Bethea. Read by Julia Whalen. At around 9:30 on the last day of September, Stephanie Hoffler was parked at a speedway in Kentucky, where she lives, when she got a strange sense that she should Google her father, whom she hadn't seen in more than 4 years. One of the first results that popped up was an obituary in the Times, which had been published 6 weeks before. "Holy shit," Hoffler said to a friend who was in the car with her. "My father's dead." She did some more Googling to make sure it wasn't a hoax. Given her father's notoriety, she figured it might be. "I remember feeling a lot of things," Hoffler told me recently. "It's hard to decide how you feel when you find out a parent you had that kind of deeply fraught history with is dead." She added, "I'd spent so long considering him a dangerous enemy to me and the country." Thomas Hoffler, who died in August at the age of 75, was raised in San Diego and served in the Navy during the Vietnam War. In the early 80s, after completing a doctorate in political science at Claremont Graduate University, he became the RNC's Data Operations Manager. In that position, he began to grasp how the redrawing of political maps could usher in a sweeping tide of Republican power in state legislatures. Congressional redistricting became his specialty. The Times obituary referred to him as the Michelangelo of the modern gerrymander. The former Congressman Lynn Westmoreland worked closely with Hoffler on Republican redistricting efforts in Georgia between 2000 and 2010. "Redistricting is the science of politics," Westmoreland told me. "It's also a blood sport for adults because it controls 10 years and it controls people's lives. It's the purest form of brass-knuckle politics that there is. And of the people I worked with over many years, Mr. Hoffler was the go-to guy. The best." He added, "When you do this for 40 years, as Tom did, you're not just doing it for the moment. You're trying to prepare for legal challenges, to anticipate what changes could be made, population growth and decline, the winds of the political environment in states and districts. Tom, he understood it all." Hoffler preferred to keep the details of his work private and to avoid paper trails. "Emails are the tool of the devil," he explained to fellow operatives. Still, he did leave some documentation behind. About a week and a half after Stephanie learned of her father's death, she made a trip to her parents' retirement home in Raleigh, North Carolina, where her mother, Kathleen, still lives, looking for keepsakes. She later described the visit in a deposition for a lawsuit concerning legislative redistricting in North Carolina. In her father's bedroom, she found a jewelry box, which had been hers as a child. She also found 4 external hard drives and 18 thumb drives that had belonged to her father. One of the drives was labeled NC Data. Hoffler took the drives to the hotel where she was staying and began to scan the contents of the devices, which contained some 75,000 files. She found early photographs of her 2 children, buried treasures, she called them in the deposition, and a music recording that she'd made, as well as letters she'd written. She also found a number of files related to her father's work. A couple of weeks after Hoffler's visit to her parents' home, Chris Morden, a lawyer in Raleigh who had done estate planning for Thomas and Kathleen Hoffler in 2016, filed a petition to have Kathleen Hoffler deemed legally incompetent. The petition cited Kathleen's recent victimization in a gift card payment scheme and an alleged attempted transfer of money to India, a country to which Kathleen has no apparent connection. The petition also reported that Kathleen is believed to be under influence of previously estranged child. In response to the petition, an interim guardian was appointed. "There was my mother, with all of her accounts frozen, scared to death, as only a competent person can be in that situation," Stephanie wrote to me in an email. "How could I proceed? I was not my father's colleague, not his co-worker or vetted friend, not even his son, only his daughter and an ordinary citizen, free from the naivete that Tom Hoffler had ever been an honest man." In the deposition, Stephanie said that she was worried that many lawyers in Raleigh would be more concerned about her father's political work than about her mother's well-being, and so she called the Raleigh office of Common Cause, a nonpartisan watchdog group focused on government accountability, to ask for a referral. The group was the plaintiff in a gerrymandering lawsuit challenging legislative maps for North Carolina that had been drawn by her father. It was just a few days before the midterm elections, and the Common Cause office was particularly busy. When Stephanie told the group's executive director in the state, Bob Phillips, on the phone that she was Thomas Hoffler's daughter, he assumed she was going to yell at him and blast the organization's efforts. Then, of course, the conversation quickly became something different, Phillips told me. It wasn't about our case. It was about her need to get an attorney for a hearing a few days later for her mother regarding her father's estate and a potential guardian that was going to be appointed. She felt like everyone was against her in Raleigh. The people around connected with her dad were all against her. She had no one she could really trust. Phillips referred her to Jane Pinsky, the person who, as Hoffler recalled, probably knew more Raleigh lawyers than anyone else on his staff. Pinsky agreed to help, and she and Hoffler spoke multiple times on the phone. In the course of those conversations, Hoffler expressed her frustration with what her mother was going through and what she saw as the political motivations of those involved. She mentioned a recent column in the Raleigh News and Observer in which the journalist David Daly, who has written extensively about gerrymandering, was quoted as saying, "It wouldn't surprise me at all if on a hard drive somewhere in Raleigh, Tom Hoffler has another set of gifts for legislators." In fact, Hoffler told Pinsky, she had multiple hard drives that had belonged to her father. She didn't know, she says, that the drives could be used in Common Cause's litigation. The case she knew about, Rucho v. Common Cause, was already on its way to the Supreme Court. But the group, it turned out, had just filed another gerrymandering lawsuit. On February 7th, a settlement was reached regarding Morden's petition of incompetency. The interim guardian was dismissed. Kathleen Hoffler agreed to put most of her assets into an irrevocable trust overseen by a neutral trustee. She was not deemed incompetent. Morden declined to comment for this story. His law partner, Nicholas Sherrill, listed as the attorney on Morden's petition, did not respond to requests for comment. 6 days later, the plaintiff's attorneys in Common Cause's new case, Common Cause v. Lewis, subpoenaed Thomas Hoffler's old hard drives. Attorneys for the defendants in the case have argued that Stephanie Hoffler obtained the drives improperly. The plaintiffs have countered that not only did she acquire them legally, with full permission from their owner, but that, even if she hadn't, the plaintiffs would still have the right to subpoena them as evidence. The law appears to be on their side. In the meantime, the hard drives have upended another case entirely, one that is not about gerrymandering, but the census. A year and a half ago, ProPublica reported that the Department of Justice had sent a letter to the Census Bureau requesting that the 2020 census include a question asking people whether they were U.S. citizens. The letter argued that adding such a question would help the department enforce the Voting Rights Act by obtaining citizen voting age population data in places where the voting power of minorities might be improperly diluted by redistricting. Legal observers were immediately suspicious of this stated reasoning. Adding a citizenship question would likely cause fewer immigrants to respond to the census, and while additional citizenship data might be useful, no one in the communities who are most affected by the Voting Rights Act has expressed concern about a lack of such data, as Michael Lee, an election law specialist at New York University's Brennan Center for Justice, pointed out at the time. Eventually, 17 states, 7 cities, and multiple nonprofit groups filed a lawsuit fighting the addition of a citizenship question to the census, and the case made its way to the Supreme Court. In May, with the Supreme Court's decision pending, attorneys at Common Cause were going through Hoffler's files when they found evidence that seemed to confirm what many had suspected, that adding a citizenship question to the census was a way to drive down immigrant participation, thus weakening their representation when subsequent congressional districts were drawn, and had nothing to do with enforcing the Voting Rights Act. Some of the language and reasoning in the Justice Department's letter appeared to come directly from Hoffler, who, they discovered, had conducted a study in 2015 on the effects of drawing congressional districts not according to a state's total population, but according to the number of voting-age citizens. Doing so, he concluded, would be advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites, and it would be impossible to do so, he wrote, without adding a citizenship question to the census. Common Cause also found email exchanges on the hard drives between Hoffler and Krista Jones, a longtime Census employee who is now Chief of Staff to the Deputy Director of the U.S. Census Bureau. Jones emailed Hoffler about the census in 2010 and again in 2015, when she pointed out that the Bureau was soliciting public comments, and noted, "This can also be an opportunity to mention citizenship as well." "You can't put this cat back in the bag," Stephanie Hoffler told me in June. "I was expecting those hard drives to be inflammatory, but I had no idea that it was that immediate and that huge, that it would be that obvious and just explode. I thought the fuse was just a little bit longer, but I didn't have the team of specialists to go through all this stuff." Hoffler and I first spoke shortly before the Supreme Court ruled on the census case. The first news stories about the hard drives and their possible ramifications had mentioned that Hoffler was estranged from her father, but those reports had not explained what led to that estrangement, or said very much about the person whose visit to her parents' home had conceivably altered American political history. In the deposition, a lawyer for the defendants said of Stephanie Hoffler, "Even a cursory review of publicly available information shows that the respondent's relationship with her father was strained." Hoffler remarked to me in an email, "Right, nothing better than a cursory review of publicly available information to unravel the complicated dynamics of familial relationships." Hoffler often speaks in metaphors, tangents, and allusions, and she described her relationship with the hard drives, fittingly, in terms of a parent's relationship to a child. "I knew the fundamental philosophical act that I was performing in liberating those hard drives, even if I didn't know exactly what was on them," she said. "It's like chasing after a toddler. I want you to be free, but I'm still technically responsible for you." Stephanie Hoffler, who was born in 1969 and grew up near Washington, D.C., has worked as a farmer, a waitress, an exotic dancer, an off-Broadway actress, and in IT support. She is also a writer. She has published poetry and essays and political commentary in obscure zines and progressive blogs, as she put it. As a kid, Hoffler told me, she rarely got in any trouble or argued with her parents. "In the Reagan years, I'd ask my dad to characterize comments made by the liberal press," she said. "I didn't have experience enough to debate him, which I would later on, calling out all of his and their bullshit." Both her parents had PhDs. Her mother was a successful psychologist. Hoffler spent one semester studying musical composition at Catholic University before dropping out. She briefly had a job with Congressional Quarterly, working on a dial-up service it had in the late 80s called Washington Alert. The Times has described Stephanie as a political progressive who despises Republican partisanship, but also has scant respect for Democrats. Hoffler told me in an email that her politics are in opposition to the state, a patriarchy at its finest, working hand in hand with the oligarchs of organized religion that discourage women from discovering their own natural power. In another email, she wrote, "Even a cursory glance at publicly available information suggests that I have a history of resistance to authority and a tendency to open my mouth when expedience would call for my silence. This, combined with my traveler's soul, results in a storied history, resume, and rap sheet, as well as a total absence of advanced degrees." By the end of her 20s, she was back in D.C., where, in 2000, she met a man named Peter Lizon at a goth techno-industrial-themed nightclub. They were both only children and black sheep, she told me. They were married in 2002. In a recent essay, she describes the beginning of their relationship in the early years of the George W. Bush administration. Together, we were artists and activists and met the coming of the new American fascism with consistent indignation and resistance. In 2004, just before the election, we were arrested during a direct action political protest. They used a bayonet knife to deface Bush-Cheney campaign signs. It became more and more obvious that homesteading in a remote locale would be the best option for us, she writes. They moved to West Virginia in 2005 and began subsistence farming in Jackson County in the northwestern part of the state. In 2009, Hoffler had a pregnancy that ended in a stillbirth. She and Lizaun had their first child a couple of years later. It was around this time that Sean Bayless, an attorney in the area, came to know them. They were the most interesting people I've probably ever dealt with in a 25-year legal career, he told me. They were living an alternative lifestyle, and I think they came here basically for the isolation. It's a rural and religious county. He went on, as self-described anarchists joined at the hip, they stuck out like a sore thumb. Speaking with them, you realize fairly quickly that these people are very bright, and they're usually 2 or 3 steps ahead of everyone around them. In 2012, Bayless, who was a criminal and family lawyer, represented Lizaun on charges of kidnapping, malicious wounding, and domestic battery. The case garnered national headlines. Peter Lizaun, West Virginia man, kept his wife and tortured her for nearly a decade, sheriff says, one of those headlines on the website of CBS News declared. Prosecutors claimed that Hoffler had given birth while in chains in the couple's basement and that Lizaun had buried a stillborn child in their backyard. There was no bizarre basement torture, Bayless told me. It was a simple domestic violence matter. Stephanie Hoffler told me that the most salacious aspects of the story, as they were reported in the press, were beyond absurd. She attributed them to someone she met at a women's shelter, where she had gone to get away from Lizaun shortly before the charges were filed. All charges against Lizaun were dismissed without prejudice prior to trial in August 2013. Stephanie didn't want to cooperate with the domestic battery charges, so they didn't go further than the grand jury. Don Moore, a professor in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa, told me, "But I know the abuse was bad because I've seen the photographs of the scars on her body. There was a lot of violence, but not what was described in the papers." My attempts to reach Lizaun for comment were unsuccessful. Mike Hissam, a lawyer who has represented Lizaun, told me, "He fell off the face of the earth. He's probably in Europe somewhere. I told him to get the hell out of Dodge after everything went down." Moore came across Hoffler's case 3 years ago while working on a study about evidence collection in domestic violence cases. "I brought her to Canada in 2017, Moore told me. She was still trying to keep a low profile and hiding from her ex, so she wasn't comfortable telling her story in the U.S. She and Moore spent the better part of a year mapping out her story, as Moore put it. Not her relationship with Peter so much as what happened in the aftermath, in the grand jury and in the family court cases, reconstructing the files for her. Together, Moore and Hoffler wrote an essay titled 45 Color Photographs, Images, Emotions, and the Victim of Domestic Violence, which appears in Emotions and Crime, Towards a Criminology of Emotions, a book that was published by Routledge in June. The essay, in Moore's words, aims to foreground the voice of someone who could so easily have remained another two-dimensional object in our research. Specifically, it interrogates the use of photographs in the case against Hoffler's ex-husband, which would ultimately lead to her own criminalization and the loss of her children in family court. When Stephanie first told me her story, I thought she was full of shit, Moore told me. It seemed so far-fetched and unbelievable, but as we started to do background research, I realized that she was, in fact, 100% accurate. Moore has examined affidavits, search warrants, and arrest warrants. At the women's shelter, Hoffler had photographs taken of the bruises and marks on her body. The shelter, Moore said, then released the photographs to Hoffler's father, and they ended up in the hands of the sheriff's office. Hoffler and Moore maintain that Thomas Hoffler suggested to his daughter that if she did not cooperate with the investigation into Peter, as Moore put it, he would use the photographs to incriminate her on the grounds of child neglect and then use the photos to challenge Stephanie's custodial rights in family court. Stephanie did not comply, and everything that Tom threatened came true, except for Peter was never convicted. As the charges against Lizon were pending, it turned into a child abuse and neglect matter, Sean Bayless told me. Hoffler denies ever neglecting or endangering her children. She says that, faced with the prospect of losing their son to the foster system, she and Lizon requested that he be placed with her parents. Shortly before the charges against Peter were dropped, Stephanie gave birth to their second child. Child and Protective Services took the child away 3 weeks later. Moore insisted to me that Thomas Hoffler was largely responsible for the termination of her parental rights. Of course, it seems understandable that a father might want his daughter to leave an abusive husband and could be concerned for the welfare of his grandchildren. But, according to Stephanie Hoffler, Moore, and 2 other people I spoke to who are familiar with the details of the case, Thomas Hoffler, after receiving custody of his daughter's first child, placed the child in foster care. Stephanie told me that both of her kids are now almost certainly with adoptive parents and that the adoption would be non-reversible. She hasn't seen her children, she said, in more than 5 years. At the time, the older of the 2 was not quite 3 years old. Her younger child was 21 months old. As is often done with cases involving minors, their custody records have been sealed. Moore has been working with the legal clinic at West Virginia Law School to rebuild Hoffler's court files as part of her ongoing academic inquiry into the way that evidence taken from victims' bodies is used to replace or antagonize reluctant/non-cooperative victims through investigation and trial, as she put it in an email. The entire project was inspired by Stephanie's case, which remains the most extreme example of what I am studying, she explained. But, she added, elements of what happened to Stephanie are reflected in almost all of the more than 70 other cases she has studied. I've got the criminal case, and we're starting to work on the family case, she said. Everything we've learned so far corroborates exactly with what Stephanie has said. She added, because of the way Stephanie meanders through a story, it'd be easy to discount her, but that's a grave error. Hers is an incredibly important story of what an utter failure the criminal justice system is, not just in the United States, but more generally. It's about how we respond to domestic violence in perverse ways. It's about how dangerous it is for the women whose cases come to the attention of authorities. Hoffler says that her father rejected her children on a lot of levels, but if I had to simplify, it was because of their mixed Slovak and American ethnicity. Lizon's parents were born in Slovakia. The Hofflers, Stephanie said, identified ethnically as American. Some of the things he said were pretty shocking, she went on. She added, he was a classist more than a bigot, and a stubborn one. He was not able to admit he was ever wrong. I don't remember a single instance. My mother says that in 52 years, she never won an argument. Kathleen Hoffler, who declined to comment for this story through her lawyer, has written 2 books about domestic violence. In the late 70s, she created a helpline for victims of domestic abuse, an organization that later became a women's shelter. In Battered Women, Shattered Lives, which was published when Stephanie was a child, Kathleen Hoffler writes, most battered women, I think, are not really eager to have their husbands put in jail. What they would like is to have their spouses stop being violent so that a good relationship can be developed. Given these circumstances, it is not surprising that many cases never reach trial. Stephanie said of her mother, what really distinguished her reaction from my father's was that she really wanted to support me and empower me. If I said, I need enough money to spend the night in a hotel, she'd want to get me that money. My father would say, hold on, who's in charge? She went on. He probably went to his grave insisting the only reason he was angry at my ex-husband was for hurting me. But that's bullshit. What he was most angry at my ex-husband for was losing control of me. Domestic violence is all about control. The one thing my ex-husband and my father had in common was an obsession with putting me in submission, having control over me, Hoffler said. A lot of times they'd work together to flush me out and then fight with each other over who'd eat me for lunch. Hoffler described her ex-husband as a radical genius, very, very good and very, very horrible. Still, she said, even in his brutality, my ex-husband showed more respect for my existence, my humanity, than my father. The custody battle, and what followed, is what caused the final rift between Stephanie and her father. He reapportioned our family, she told me. He didn't want to live in a majority-minority district. She added, "This irreverence is how I get through life." Hoffler says that she spoke with her father on more than one occasion about the idea of using the census to help shift political power. She would point out that making census forms more invasive would likely lead to fewer disenfranchised people answering them, and her father, she recalls, would say, well, if you're not going to get counted, you're not going to get represented. She also maintains that, before she became estranged from him, her father talked with her about redistricting in North Carolina and about something that he found difficult to manage in his clients, which he would avoid explicitly defining. In the case of the North Carolina legislators, she said, it was a twofold problem. One, this tendency to wear racism out and proud, which would shine the light on what he was trying to obfuscate, and two, the tendency to get greedy. Tim Story, a redistricting expert at the National Conference of State Legislatures, knew Thomas Hoffler as a collegial friend for 3 decades. I asked him about the allegations that Hoffler's redistricting work was motivated by bigotry. Tom was not an evil guy, Story insisted. He was just playing on one team, wearing one jersey, playing within the rules as they were set out to maximize the Republican advantage. I didn't see him as a racist. He never made any comments to that effect. He added, if African Americans were going to vote mostly for Democrats, well, he was drawing plans to advantage Republicans. But was he racially motivated? I don't know. He wasn't Darth Vader. In late June, the Supreme Court ruled in Rucho v. Common Cause that the federal judiciary did not have the authority to stop legislators from drawing district maps in order to maximize partisan advantage. It was a 5-4 decision, split along ideological lines, with the conservative justices all in support. Later that day, the court issued its ruling on the Census case. It was another 5-4 decision, but this time, Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion for both of the cases, sided with the liberal wing of the court, concluding that the Commerce Department's stated reason for adding a citizenship question, that it would help the department enforce the Voting Rights Act, seems to have been contrived. The evidence, Roberts wrote, tells a story that does not match the explanation the Secretary gave for his decision. For this reason, Roberts sent the case back to a lower court, which had granted the Commerce Department the opportunity to provide a new rationale for adding the question. I must say, it's refreshing to hear a judge confirm the truth that judicial review ought to be more than just an empty ritual, Stephanie Hoffler told me after reading Roberts's opinion. It appears likely that Roberts's deciding vote was influenced by the evidence that Hoffler brought to light. Chief Justice Roberts is somebody who is very concerned with the institutional reputation of the court, and the Hoffler documents, which the court was clearly aware of, cast so much doubt about the government's stated reasons for wanting a citizenship question. Michael Lee, the election law specialist, told me, it just smelled and felt like something was wrong. Days after the ruling, the Commerce Department issued a statement that census forms would be printed without a citizenship question. Hours later, President Trump tweeted that reports mentioning this fact were incorrect or, to state it differently, fake. We are absolutely moving forward as we must because of the importance of the answer to this question. On Sunday, The Times reported that the Justice Department would replace its entire team of lawyers on the case. On Tuesday, a federal judge ruled that this was not permissible, calling the department's stated reasoning for the wholesale switch patently deficient. Finally, on Thursday afternoon, in a press conference at the Rose Garden, Trump said that his administration would no longer seek to add a citizenship question, and that he was issuing an executive order that called on the Commerce Department to comb through all legally accessible records related to citizenship. The order appears to demand something that was already taking place. Trump also said, when speaking of the need for citizenship data, some states may want to draw state and local legislative districts based upon the voter-eligible population. The comment reinforced the impression that adding the citizenship question was always an effort to strengthen the Republican Party's advantage in future redistricting by amplifying the representation of, as Thomas Hofeller put it, non-Hispanic whites. A few hours later, the Justice Department sent a letter to the district court judges in Maryland and New York who have adjudicated the census case, informing them that they plan to discuss appropriate next steps in these proceedings. A lawyer for the New York Immigration Coalition, one of the groups that sued the Commerce Department over the matter, said that the group will file a motion seeking sanctions against the government for their false testimony in the case, citing the evidence on Hofeller's hard drives. Common Cause v. Lewis, the North Carolina gerrymandering case for which the drives were originally subpoenaed, is set to go to trial next week. Though the Supreme Court ruled in Rucho v. Common Cause that federal courts should not be involved in disputes about partisan gerrymandering, it left the matter open for state courts. It will soon be a year since Thomas Hofeller died. Stephanie told me that she's still haunted by the memory of her father. He was one of my most powerful enemies, she said. When he was gone, the fear was gone. Then the sadness set in. She dreams about him often, she told me. I have nightmares, mostly. He's never paying attention. There's something I have to tell him, and he's always doing something different. As for the attention being paid to the material in her father's old hard drives, she said, I'm really glad that people are talking to each other and contemplating the revelation of yet another juicy detail of the abuse of power. While the courts contemplate our fate, we can step back and think about ways that we could grant ourselves liberty without the permission of our captors. On the day her father died, in August, Stephanie was on vacation in Detroit, having just finished a draft of 45 color photographs. She was sitting with a friend, having coffee, finally feeling satisfied, she said. In the essay, Hofeller writes, As I view the shelter photographs now, I do feel a certain pride in exposure. When it's you that shares something private and personal, there is a different effect to that exposure. For example, as a stripper, once I got over the awkwardness of being naked on stage, I felt a certain pride at taking ownership of my own body, my own sexuality, and using it to empower myself. And now, if I can, by taking the risk of exposing myself again, draw attention to the crimes of those in power, well, that seems to me the best kind of exposure there is.